On January 25th, 2006, officials from a North London housing association entered a bedsit in Wood Green, preparing to repossess the property due to unpaid rent. Inside, they made a horrifying discovery: the skeletal remains of a 38-year-old woman lying on the floor. The woman was Joyce Carol Vincent, and she had been dead for almost 3 years. It's an occurrence that's both tragic and at the same time deeply unsettling. Someone dies alone, unnoticed in a busy community. They may have been the quiet neighbour, the elderly person down the hall in the apartment complex, or the solitary figure whom no one ever really got to know. Life goes on around them. Neighbours continue their routines, unaware of the silent death nearby, the presence of a corpse hidden just beyond their walls. But as time passes, the feeling that something is wrong begins to creep into the community. A faint, unpleasant odour begins to seep into the hallways, through the walls and out into the street. People start to notice this strange smell, something sickly and unnatural. At first, they might dismiss it, thinking it's just a trash problem, a dead animal, or a plumbing issue. But the smell doesn't go away. It grows stronger, more persistent, creeping into every corner and space. And then comes the horrific realization: it's the smell of death, a rotting corpse hidden away for weeks, months, or even years. The forgotten presence of a once living person whose absence went unnoticed for far too long. These are some of the most true, unsettling stories that I've ever come across, of bodies that were found after years, or while being hidden in plain sight, and haunting their communities with the stench of decay and all the horrors that come from living with a corpse. When the body of Joyce Carol Vincent was discovered, the scene was surreal. A television, still tuned to BBC One, filled the room with its flickering blue light. Piles of unopened Christmas presents were scattered on the dusty floor, a haunting reminder of the holiday season that had passed by without her. Dishes were stacked in the sink, and a pile of letters lay untouched by the front door. The food in the refrigerator bore expiration dates from 2003. It was clear that Joyce had died alone a long time ago, and nobody had noticed. By the time she was found, Joyce's body had decomposed beyond recognition, leaving only a skeleton. Identification was possible only through dental records and a holiday photograph that was found in the room. Although no one had discovered her body, neighbours had complained about a bad smell for years, assuming it was just the garbage bins beneath the apartment. The stench of decay had embedded itself into the walls, a sickly sweet odour that lingered in the hallways, ignored and brushed off by residents. Flies had even gathered around the windows, but no one thought to investigate further. Little did they know that a corpse was decaying in their midst. When officials found her, Joyce was on the floor, still clutching a shopping bag. The cause of death was undetermined due to the advanced state of decomposition, but there were no signs of foul play, suggesting that she had died of natural causes. As with all of these tragic cases, the shocking part was not just her lonely death, but how unnoticed her absence went. No friends, no family, no co-workers raised the alarm. Joyce had simply vanished, and life went on around her. Despite cities being seemingly bustling social environments, they can also be deeply isolating places where a person can die and decay, their presence fading into the background until the smell of death becomes too strong to ignore. The sickly odour of rot hung thick in the air, emanating from an unassuming suburban home in Pontiac, Michigan. For years, neighbours had wrinkled their noses at the foul stench wafting from the residence of Pier Fareno, assuming it had been some mundane explanation like blocked drains, a dead animal, or neglected rubbish. Little did they know the horrific truth that lay festering behind those walls. Pier was an intelligent, solitary soul who had long embraced a nomadic lifestyle, travelling the globe and keeping her family at arm's length, with sporadic postcards from exotic locations like Amsterdam and the Italian Alps. Though she had come from a large, close-knit Catholic family in South Boston, Pier's independence and brilliance set her apart from an early age. After a promising academic start at Cardinal Cushing Central High School, where she excelled and earned a college scholarship, Pier's path became less conventional. She drifted between universities without completing a degree, eventually finding her way into the tech world as a programmer at Fidelity National Information Services. For over 2 decades, she thrived in this role, her wanderlust fueled by frequent business travel. By the early 2000s, Pier had settled into a comfortable life in Pontiac, purchasing a home in a middle-class neighborhood. However, her struggles with weight led her to an ill-fated business venture in 2003, an ambitious plan to open a fitness franchise called Slender Lady in nearby Waterford. When the endeavour failed, saddling her with over $100,000 in debt, Pier's life began to unravel. As the debts mounted and credit collectors closed in, Pier retreated further into herself, shutting out the world. Neighbours noticed her increasingly reclusive behaviour. She stopped answering the door, retrieving her mail, and eventually resigned from her job under unclear circumstances in 2008. Left with only the $87,199.80 in her bank account, Pier's life became an exercise in invisibility. Her mortgage and utilities paid automatically as the years went by. To the outside world, there were no overt signs of crisis. Neighbours continued to mow her lawn and even clear her driveway, assuming she had moved or was simply away on one of her frequent travels. Even her mail carrier stopped delivering, believing the home was vacant as letters had piled up unclaimed. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a dark truth was rotting. It wasn't until March the 5th, 2014, that the horrifying reality of Pier's fate was finally discovered. 2 repairmen tasked with fixing a hole in the roof of her foreclosed home entered the detached garage and were immediately struck by an overpowering stench. As they approached Pier's Jeep, still parked inside, one of the men opened the backseat door, believing he had seen a Halloween mask propped up in the dim light. But the gruesome sight that awaited them was no Halloween prank. It was Pier's mummified remains, slumped in the back seat, in a black jacket and blue shirt, $500 cash in her pocket. The key was partially in the ignition, and an empty wine bottle lay nearby, though it bore no fingerprints. Most unsettlingly, the body had been there for years, decaying to the point of mummification, while her bills continued to be paid, masking the reality that she had likely died as far back as in 2009. While the exact cause of death could not be fully determined, the scene spoke of extreme isolation, taken to its most horrifying conclusion. The most unsettling case, however, of a body discovered after years was that of John Sabine. In the quiet village of Beddau, South Wales, nestled among picturesque streets and quaint homes, stood a nondescript block of flats that housed a seemingly tight-knit community. Notably, for nearly 2 decades, the residents had enjoyed a peaceful existence, free from the spectre of murder, until a shocking discovery in the back garden shattered their tranquil facade. In 2015, the mummified body of John Sabine was discovered in the back garden of the flat, wrapped tightly in plastic bags. The shocking revelation? John had been dead for 18 long years, but his wife, possessed by some indescribable darkness, had continued collecting his pension payments, keeping the decomposing corpse of her supposed loved one hidden away for financial gain. The discovery began all as an innocent misunderstanding between friends Michelle James and Ryan Lee. One day, while the two friends were chatting with Lee Sabine, an eccentric former tenant known for her wild stories, she excitedly mentioned a medical skeleton she claimed to have in her flat. Intrigued and amused, Michelle and Ryan decided it would be the perfect prank to find a similar skeleton and surprise their neighbours with it. Shortly after that conversation, they stumbled upon a strange, tightly wrapped package in the back garden that somewhat resembled a human form. They decided that it had to be the very medical skeleton that Lee had described due to its bizarre shape, and so the two began to eagerly cut it open. But their excitement quickly turned to horror as a foul-smelling fluid oozed out, staining their hands. In a panic, they immediately alerted the authorities. What had started out as a joke quickly transformed into a dark, unspeakable horror. The first officers on the scene were met with a stench that they would never forget. PC Joy Nichols remembers the smell as overwhelming. They soon discovered the source when they revealed what was actually wrapped inside the package. A human corpse, mummified and cocooned in layers of carpet and plastic. A pathologist's examination revealed it to be the remains of a man in his 40s who had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. An investigation was swiftly launched, and a twisted web began to unravel around that former tenant of the flats, Lee Sabine, the very woman who had spun the tall tale of a medical skeleton to Michelle and Ryan. As detectives delved into her history, suspicions mounted against her. Neighbours recalled her erratic behaviour and odd comments about her husband, who had mysteriously disappeared nearly 2 decades earlier. Evidence began to surface that painted a far darker picture. Lee's stories about her life were inconsistent and increasingly bizarre. The police uncovered that John Sabine had been missing since 1997, with no official records of his existence after that year, aside from a tenant agreement from when they had moved in together. As forensic teams processed the scene, they found additional clues suggesting foul play. The body was eventually fully identified as John Sabine, Lee's long-missing husband, and even more unsettling details began to emerge. Lee had admitted to murdering her husband during a phone call with a friend back in 1997, the year that he had gone missing. This chilling confession became pivotal evidence against her. Lee's own carer, Line Williams, recounted her bizarre fixation with a medical skeleton that she claimed was in her flat, ominously adding, "You never know, Line," when questioned if it was real. The coroner's inquest of 2016 officially ruled John Sabine was unlawfully killed by his wife, possibly bludgeoned to death with an ornamental frog figurine. Detectives pieced together the timeline leading up to John's death, and they discovered that Lee had been living under an assumed identity for years while maintaining her facade as a harmless eccentric. Her meticulous efforts to conceal the truth only intensified suspicions surrounding her innocence. But in a bitter twist of fate, Lee Sabine passed away from terminal cancer just a month before her heinous secret was discovered. The full truth would never be known, as Lee Sabine was no longer around to reveal it. But an even darker family history began to emerge, only leaving us with further questions. Decades earlier, the Sabines had been investigated for abandoning their 5 children in New Zealand. A documentary crew, captivated by the unanswered questions of the Sabines' dark past, managed to track down the only living Sabine daughter, Jane, and her chilling verdict spoke volumes. "I have no doubt my mother was capable of murder," and so the sleepy town of Bethi was forced to confront the fact that a remorseless killer had been living among them for decades, her grisly secret hidden in plain sight.